Kia ora and welcome everyone to this webinar on research involving children. My name is Eliza Raymond and I will be your chair for today. And I'm really looking forward to this webinar. I'm currently doing my PhD in tourism management at Victoria University of Wellington and using a child-centered research approach. And I'm also the co-founder of Good Travel, which is a social enterprise that really advocates for greater awareness and action around child protection, particularly within tourism destinations. So let me share my screen with you and tell you a little bit about what to expect for today. So the purpose of today's session is to explore contemporary issues, theoretical foundations and ethical considerations of research involving children. And to give you a little bit of context about what we'll be talking about, some of you might be aware that the UNWTO recently hosted the Global Youth Tourism Summit, which was a really exciting event highlighting the importance of enhancing the engagement of children in the tourism sector. And at the same time, tourism scholars, like some of the ones we're going to be hearing from today, are increasingly recognizing the current scarcity of tourism research with children and really highlighting the urgency of advancing a child-centered research agenda within tourism. So it's a very timely topic, I think, and a very important one. We have three fantastic presentations coming up from 4 presenters. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to draw your attention to the Q&A chat box. So please post your questions in there at any time, and we'll discuss them at the end of the 3 presentations. You'll also see an upvote function in the Q&A chat, so you're welcome to use that so we can kind of see which are the most popular or important questions to address at the end of the webinar. So our first speaker today is Heike Schensel. Heike is an associate professor and the academic lead of the PhD program in the School of Hospitality and Tourism at Auckland University of Technology. She's published widely on families, children, and gender issues in tourism. And today she'll be presenting on developments in academic tourism research with children and future considerations. So I will hand over to you, Heike.
Great, thank you, Eliza. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Ian, for organizing the webinar. Yeah, so my name is Heike Schensel, and yeah, I will take you through some of the developments and a few considerations. But Eliza, next slide, please. So I want to talk about tourism research with children publication developments and also some future considerations. Then I will talk a little bit about career prospects of researching with children. And then I will delve into ethics application constraints, which is hampering some of the progression really in research with children. Next slide, please. So this is very, very, of course, schematic, but I have looked through some of the literature and tried to find a bit of a pattern. And it's really interesting to see that in the 1990s, Cullingford, a very influential article, actually included children as active agents. And then in the 2000s, and this is really when I became active in the field, this is when I did my PhD at Victoria University. A lot of research really was westernized, middle class, nuclear families, including my research. But initially, it was quite a bit from a female perspective, mothers as gatekeepers of the families. And so my PhD really tried to actually include fathers as well as children. So there was more inclusion of children happening in this decade, but also research on social tourism. So that's part of that. And then the 2010s, this is really the decade where research out of Asia, or family research we're talking about here, especially Chinese families, but also Singapore and Malaysian families as well. And also multi-generational, more research on grandparents were included. So increasing inclusion of children and also growth of publications in family research with children. And then really in this decade, it's become a lot more diversified. We've seen a lot more research specific family adventure tourism, more specific to destination, but also more focus on well-being and benefits. Another thing that's really been happening in the last few years is more review articles highlighting the significant gaps. So also, increasingly, children are being included as active agents, and there has been a real growth in publications. There's still a lot of gaps, and that really leads me to, going forward, academic research needing more diversification in scope. Next slide, please. Now, someone in Turkey, Celebi, actually did quite a bit of, and that's part of that reviewing and looking at Web of Science publications in child research and tourism. So this is not just family research from 1995 to 2022. So she, out of 152 studies, 73% were qualitative. I think that's what we're probably expecting anyway. But tellingly, only 33 collected data with children. And so what we can actually see, there are really two main clusters. And one is where children as tourists, be it part of the family or children themselves. So we've got young children, leisure children, family vacation and holidays, but also part of something more specific like museum. And then, of course, the other cluster is child sex tourism and volunteer tourism and a bit of social tourism as well. But next slide, that really leads me to a lot of gaps because there is very little research yet really on children as in host destinations, which is, of course, what Antonia did. And I'm sure she will talk about that one and also other issues as well. So even so, we've seen quite a bit of pros. A lot more depth in scope is needed in research with children. And I sort of mentioned that in the last few years, there's been more focus on well-being and benefits, but there really needs to be more focus on problematic issues, like, for example, family violence or child custody issues. In New Zealand, we're actually experiencing quite an epidemic of family violence. I mean, this is not going away when you go on holiday. And I know that Eliza Senfeld is actually doing more research in this area. Another one is really child labor issues as well. And then, as I sort of mentioned, what's really needed as well is the inclusion of research on host children, for example, with destination management, but also as part of a family business or family entrepreneurship. So I have a student in China, in Hainan Island, who currently is actually doing research on that. And we did a review article with Antonia where we identified, actually, I think it was only 2 articles who included some voices of children. So there's still really, really big gaps. And really what we need to learn from that is that anything concerning, children as the future consumer, host and producer of tourism, we need to include these voices because this is vital to achieve sustainability. They are the future generation for whatever is happening and concerning tourism. Next slide. Now I've put this in career prospects because my career is very much built on family research, and I've got comments in the past that I probably have to diversify more. I have to sort of look at, other aspects. You can't really become a professor that way. So there are still perceptions of, including children in research might not be serious enough research. The other thing I really like to comment on is the feminization. And as you can see here, the moderator as well as all the presenters are women. And while this is actually a really, really good thing, and I know Freya actually commented on that, I would actually consider it a little bit problematic. And we have commented on this before in an editorial with Neil Carr, where, why is it that it's mainly women who actually are in this field and are actually conducting research with children? Ideally, I would like to see more maturity. I would like to see more professors, male professors, who also are in the field, which really gets me to my second point, the transient nature of the field. So there are quite a few who write some really significant articles or books, like, for example, Neil Carr, his very influential book on children and families on family holidays. But he's not longer really active in the field. I know he's supervising PhD students. So there's quite a few who actually come in, write a few articles or a book and actually no longer active in the field. And I think it's complex, and we can maybe debate that at the end. So I haven't really quite got the time to get into that. One thing is, maybe because it's time consuming, it's special expertise that's needed. And then also the ethics application, and that really, I will get to that after this as well. Um, other thing is maybe it's easier for women. I've seen, some male doing research as well who find it actually a bit harder to actually then sit down with women and doing research. So I think it's something to be mindful of. And yeah, as I say, we can probably debate this a little bit later on as well. The other one is really the lack of traction, and that has been, raised previously. So I've put down this reference of Jenny Small, which was or still is a very influential article, The Absence of Childhood in Tourism Studies in Annals of Tourism Research. I'm sure we all have referenced it before. Very influential, was very important for my PhD. It has garnered 185 citations. So, this is 15 years ago, very influential article in Annals. That should be in the thousands probably, but yeah, it's not that kind of field. So getting traction, and in terms of career prospects, doing research with children probably doesn't fast track your career to become a professor. There's sort of other topics as such, Next slide, please. So that gets me to my last slide, the ethical considerations. One is, I think, sometimes almost an active discouragement to include children. So for our doctoral board, whenever you have to fill out the full proposal, it asks you, are children included in this research? And if you tick it, you actually need to have police clearance. And it's quite often you get comments, oh, can you really do this? This is really difficult. So that's almost like an active disencouragement. And to me, and I'm sure Antonia will talk more about that, she addresses some of these issues later on. So I just want to raise it from my experience and from my master's and PhD students, what we are experiencing, that we're actually not asking, if you do research, does this have an impact on children? And if you tick yes, the next question goes, are you including children's voices? And if you tick no, you actually then have to justify why not, but we don't do that, do we? So one is actually the time-consuming ethics application process. I have quite a few PhD students and a master students, and particularly for the master student, when you've only got 1 year, it is timely. It took a long time. You can get it through. All my research students do include children's voices as part of the family, and I spoke to, the senior at the ethics committee, and she was very supportive, but you do have to submit all these extra information sheets for young children, for teenagers, for adults. So it definitely takes time, and that, of course, my next point, that potentially can lead to costly delays in research. And again, we're all time constrained. Can we actually afford it? Yes, it's really important, but yeah, it's part of these issues. And that really leads me to my next point. And it's almost like rounding it out, because initially I said we do actually need more research into more problematic areas, but it's also particularly hard to get ethics clearance, at least in New Zealand, and I think in Australia it's the same, for more sensitive topics. So the more sensitive topics which are actually needed are also harder to actually get ethics clearance and get through the ethics committee. And I think that just about leaves me according to my stopwatch. So thank you very much. And I hand over to Antonia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heike. That was a fantastic introduction to some of the opportunities and challenges I think that we face working in this area. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Antonia Canosa. Antonia is an anthropologist and research fellow with the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University in Australia. Her work focuses on children's rights, participation and well-being in the context of tourism. And today she'll be presenting on how to move beyond research on children to research with children. So over to you, Antonia.
Thanks very much, Eliza, and lovely to be with you all today. Just before I start, I thought I'd acknowledge and pay respect to the Araku people of the Bangjalang Nation on whose land I work and live in. I'm working from home today. I live in the beautiful Byron Bay area in Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So lovely to be with you. Thanks for the introduction, Eliza. I'm really passionate about doing research with children. So I work in the areas of children's rights, well-being, participation, and I do that across two different disciplines, so tourism studies and childhood studies. So most of our projects within the Centre for Children and Young People are conceived in collaboration with young people. So most of our work is participatory. So I thought I'd present to you today on how to move beyond research on children to a more participatory approach and actually research with children. So to do that, I think we need, and Heike has highlighted really well the gaps that are currently, the future researchers need to fill. So in our next slide, Eliza, thank you. I wanted to introduce you to this concept of childism. I think to move forward in this area of research, we really need a solid theoretical foundation. And childism is a really good critical lens employed to understand children's marginalized experiences. So we've said that children have been marginalized in research, but not just in research, historically, also in society and in communities. So childism is like feminism, but for children. So some of those critical lenses like post-colonialism, feminism, anti-racism, childism really provides a great epistemological and ontological foundation to deconstruct some of that adultism that's permeated society and tourism studies as well, and reconstruct more age-inclusive research and advocacy. And so for this to happen, we really need to shift how we think about children. They're not just vulnerable, they're not just immature and in the process of developing into adults, they're actually rights holders and social agents, as Heike pointed out. So in the next slide, I just wanted to introduce you to some of the key principles of this theoretical lens. So children are human beings, not just human becomings. They're not just adults in the making. They're actually children right now, and they have important perspectives and lived experiences to contribute to our research. And for us researchers, I think their vulnerability should never prevent us from including them in our research and hearing directly from them when we can. Also, this notion that children have human rights equal to adults. So I'll talk to you in a minute about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. As Heike said, children are social agents and they're able to make a contribution, not just to research, but also to, for example, tourism planning, tourism policy. And this notion that childhood is socially constructed and culturally situated. So meaning that children are a social category that has been historically marginalized. And if we want to use, Paulo Freire's terms, have been oppressed historically. So why is this important for tourism? In the next slide, thanks, Eliza. I think childism provides a really solid basis to solve some of the big social justice issues in tourism. So we're talking about things like orphanage tourism, or, how can children be involved in sustainable tourism planning in the communities where they grow up, so host children. How can children become responsible tourists and then, influence their family when they go traveling? But, if we want to do research with children, it's our ethical obligation, I think, to really pay attention to their rights and how to uphold their rights during the research process. So, ethics isn't just a ticker box that we fill out the form and then we forget about ethics when we go into the field, but it's actually really a process that we need to keep on thinking about. Am I upholding their rights during the field work? So in the next slide, I just wanted to briefly introduce you to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC. It's one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in history. It was ratified in 1989, and it's really helped transform children's lives around the world. And for us researchers, I think Article 12 is really important, voice in all matters that affect them. So there's 54 articles, and they're usually grouped into three, they're called the 3 Ps: provision, protection, and participation. So when we're researching with children, we really need to think about their participation rights. So their vulnerability should never eclipse their agency. So how do we uphold children's rights to have a voice and have a say in how they participate in our research? I think that's really important. We need to really plan our research in collaboration with them, so that they have a voice and that can make decisions about how they want to participate in our research. So to get started, in the next slide, in my own research, I found that the ERIC website is really helpful. ERIC stands for Ethical Research Involving Children. It's a partnership between UNICEF and the centre where I work. And it's a really good starting point for, all those methodological and ethical nitty-gritty questions that you might be grappling with in your own research. As I mentioned, research ethics isn't just a ticker box. You fill out the form, you get approval, and then, you forget about it. But when you're in the field, when you're doing your field work, when you're collecting data with children, you have to go through all those ethical decision-making processes that happen in situ. And so, remaining reflexive and attuned to the needs of your young participants takes, a bit of reflexivity, we call it. And so this website has some great information that can help you plan your research and help you during your research, and then the dissemination phase, which is also really important and that we hardly ever talk about, but how to disseminate findings that are created in collaboration with your young participants. So I think the main thing I've learned in my journey researching with children is to plan your research in partnership with them. So in the next slide, I just thought I'd leave you with a few tips. So I've been involved in 8 big research projects, and they're not all in tourism. So we do research in schools and in communities. We've done a couple of big research projects with children with disability and children living in residential care services here in Australia. So before you start your research project, really plan and consult with the children and young people, or ideally your research participants. So we talk about children as this homogenized group, but really, if you're researching with children in New Zealand, it might be very different from researching with children in Australia. So if you are able to, and I know this is sometimes time consuming, but consult with a group of your young participants and ask them how they would like to be involved in the research project. And this might require, multiple changes of protocol with your ethics committee, but it's really worth it because you are collecting more meaningful data and you are upholding their right to have a voice in your research. And we call this child-led research or co-researching with children. So you can see in that image on the left-hand side, there's children playing with little plasticine figures, and that was during my PhD. They actually created some short films or animations with the clay figurines, and they were exploring their experiences of growing up in a tourist destination through that medium. So which brings me to the next point, is employ creative methods. Ask your participants how they would like to be involved. If they would like to be involved with, in interviews using drawing or, plasticine, film, theatre, whatever engages them and makes them, want to participate in your research. Because, sometimes it can be a bit boring being in a research interview and having an adult, someone that you don't know, asking you all these questions. So creative methods is a really good way to engage young people. And on the right hand side, there's an image of the young people in our latest research project, where they actually created a theatre performance based on the findings of our research. So they co-researched and collected peer interviews in the community. Then they created the play, and then they performed that play in the community, which was a great educational experience for them. The last point is, and I think Heike mentioned this before, have really open conversations with your university ethics board, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to have that relationship with them and challenge some of their decisions sometimes, and back up your argument with solid scholarship, saying, I want to put my participants at the center of this project. I want to make my project more participatory. This is the scholarship that I'm drawing on, and it's really valid, and this is how I can do it. So have those open conversations, because it's really worth it. When you get those setbacks, you want to be able to push forward and make a statement there. So I think I've gone a bit over time, but really passionate. I'm just leaving you with a few references of my own work. If you can't access some of those articles, please get in touch. I would love to talk more, and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was so interesting, and great to have some of those practical tips there at the end. And for anyone else perhaps new to this area or interested in doing more research, I really recommend the website Antonia was discussing, the Ethical Research Involving Children website. It has been such a great resource for my PhD, and there's just so much great information in there. So just before we turn to our final presentation, I just want to remind everyone to please post your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll be coming to them at the end, but feel free to post them in there at any time and upvote the questions that you're keen on hearing the answers to. So for our final presentation, I'll now hand over to Dr. Julia Albrecht and Fatima Chirani, who are from the University of Otago, and they will be speaking about their research work piloting child-centered and child-led methodologies to involve and inspire responsible visitors of tomorrow. So over to you, Julia and Fatima.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eliza, and also to Ian for organizing this session. So the research that we're presenting is a collaboration not only of myself and Chirani. Let's also not forget Eliza, who isn't participating because she's chairing this session today. So unlike the other presenters, I personally don't have a long history of research with children. I came here through long-standing interests in sustainability, destination management, and behavior change for sustainable travel. And at some point, you can't ignore the fact that children are obviously a very important part of this. So this is a pilot project that we did that is very much exploratory in nature. And we were interested in looking at methodology specifically to consider issues around sustainability in destinations with children. Could we get the next slide, please? Thank you. So underlying motivation and assumption for this work is that if children grow up with an awareness of responsible travel, with host community concerns and essentially good visitor behavior, then they would be more likely to leave a positive impact on the places that they visit and may ultimately transform travel one trip or perhaps one generation at a time. But having said that, we don't only have this underrepresentation of children in tourism research, we also have this underrepresentation in tourism destination planning and management, and also in the research underlying those processes. So clearly greater presence, involvement, or even leadership of children in this type of research is bound to be conducive to sustainable or more responsible tourism more broadly. And I would also like to put forward the fact that it's in many ways an ethical obligation to involve children in these processes, because they are important stakeholders in all things tourism, not only as travelers, but also as host community residents. So the idea of childism that Antonia has talked about before is very relevant in the context of destination planning and management as well. Also, we know through studies not only in tourism but also elsewhere that younger generations have been shown to have a comparatively high awareness of environmental concerns and social concerns generally. So as such, we do know that they can be important advocates for sustainability. And in this project, we have tried different ways in which to discuss matters of sustainability and tourism with children, but we also wanted to include children in the decision-making as to what these issues were that are important in this discussion in the first place. And I now hand over to Shirani to explain the methods and methodologies that we tried in more detail.
Thank you, Julia. Eliza, can I have please the next slide? Thank you. So as many of you mentioned, Antonia, Heike, and even Julia mentioned about children being stakeholders and how important it is to respect their voice as well as knowing their agency when we do the research. So we took this voice, the agency, and being stakeholders, children as stakeholders, these concepts very seriously when we did our research. And our focus was on children who were within residing in the destination. And to reach these children, we, as a pilot project, we took 2 settings, and we decided on reaching children through a school setting and also through a family setting. So we started with a school, which is just one single school in Dunedin, which is McEndroe-based school in Dunedin. So we approached the school. And thankfully, one year 6 classroom, which is constituting of children within the age range of 10 to 11 years, they volunteered to participate in our project. And so we are very grateful and thankful for their participation in the project. And at the same time, the school helped us to reach other potential families. And we had 6 families with children within the age range of 2 to 10 years who expressed an interest to participate. And they and from most of these families, except for 2 families, we had the family interviews done in their family homes. But I think one thing which we really observed from both this in the school setting as in the family setting is most of the children that we did who got involved in our study, they were really privileged. Most of them have traveled extensively, and there were many good experienced travelers among them. So that's something we really observed. Can we move into the next slide, Elisa? Thank you. So, recognizing the fact that children are diverse, and it's becoming more common as we learn when we're researching with children, we did trial a number of methods when we worked with the children. And not only we just worked with the children, we also tried to work, help and get co-lead and do a bit of research by children. So if you can see the adult-led, co-led, child-led. So we kind of moved on from an adult-led process to a child-led process in our research. Now, since considering the time factor, I'm not going to talk much about the family interviews, the whole family interviews we did, but we started at the school with a very teacher-oriented, teacher-facilitated focus group, which is much more a traditional type, I would say, but with children, it's still very uncommon. But then also we did Lego serious play workshops with children expressing their views using different Lego models. So these 2 sessions, the teacher-led focus group and researcher-led Lego serious play, it was really helpful for us because it kind of gave us insights on really important topics and important ideas which really mattered to the children. So we took these ideas and topics on board, and we kind of fed these ideas into our next sessions, which is the co-led and child-led sessions. So these topics, which was really interest to children, became the point of discussion for the family interviews as well for the co-led sessions. So the co-led sessions, where we kind of co-partnered with the children. We were there for the children, we supported the children, but at the same time, we tried to reduce our interference as much possible so the children can really bring out their voices and carry out the whole process the way they wanted it. And for the final one, the child-led interviews, it was completely driven by the children. So it was adult-free, but we did, knowing that this is research is a very adult-driven process, we did guide the children at the start on the process with some guidelines. So I would say that it is a high time that we move from more adult-led to child-led process as we progress with researching with children. Now, pass on to Julia to talk more about the findings and outcome of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirani. So we have first analyzed our findings for each method separately, and then we looked at our findings across all the methods that we tried. And we came up with these 5 key themes, which cover a variety of the characteristics of the methods that we tried. So there was some focus on the type of responses that we've got and how they related to how the questions were asked and by whom. We looked at the extent to which we and our co-researchers and the children achieved engagement with research respondents and so on. So we could talk about this for a long time, but for the purposes of today, we chose 3 items to focus on. And the first is the very clear preference that children appear to have for being interviewed by other children rather than by adults. And there was also preference for interactions to be child-led as well. So for us as researchers, this meant that we were de facto observers in a situation, and we removed ourselves in terms of our input, but also spatially a little bit from the situation so as to not interfere as much. While this was very illuminating to watch, I will say that as a researcher, some of it felt like a bit of a sacrifice on our part, because when there were interesting points that I would have loved to follow up on, I found it hard at times not to ask a question. So there is this, which really requires a rethinking of how we engage with our research participants. And that was a very steep learning curve, I thought. We also have a bit of a conundrum going on, because we did see that where there were good questions that used situational questions or storytelling techniques, we did see that the responses were more detailed. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And one way forward could be to involve children of different ages in these types of conversations, where perhaps the older children that have a bit more experience in social settings may be working with younger or other children. We were very impressed with the extent to which children kept on task through the entire conversation. Could we get the next slide, please? Thank you. So typically in conversations about sustainability with research participants, I have found that destination planners and managers, they like to deviate and talk about other things. Children, not so much. They stayed on topic the entire time. And that was regardless of whether or not there was adult involvement in the interview or not. We found the Lego serious play an excellent technique to involve everyone in the conversation and not only the more vocal children. That was a very useful thing to be doing. And we also found that the different methods that we tried resulted in very articulate responses with regard to what constitutes sustainability in a destination, but also sustainability when children are traveling themselves. So overall, we found this pilot incredibly illuminating, and we found that not only is it obviously worth and ethically the right thing to do to engage children in these kinds of conversations, we were also very impressed with the insight and nuance of responses that we have found, and we look forward to more to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia and Sharani. That was the perfect way to kind of round up the series of presentations and really putting some of those tips from Antonia into practice with real practical examples of what that looked like in your research, in our research. So we now have some time for questions. Thank you so much for all sticking to your time limits. So I will open it up to questions. I can see some starting to pop up. So the first one here is from Victoria Colden Fassel, and she's saying, a small question. As a research ethics advisor, I often encourage people to thank their participants by giving koha, or a token of appreciation. Sometimes applicants want to give children small toys or chocolate, which can be problematic in some contexts. I would be interested to know if you have any specific views on the appropriateness of gifts for child participants. So I'll give that one to Antonia to kick us off, because I know Antonia has a lot of experience with this.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think, I think children and young people should be compensated for the time they put in, and they're giving us their lived experiences. So we in our research project, we generally include that in our ethics applications, and we generally give our participants like a voucher for something. So it's like in schools, it can be a canteen voucher. In projects in the community, like a gift voucher from a store, but it's generally not like it's a token, so it's a small amount, and we generally don't advertise that when we're recruiting participants. So it's more asking them to participate in our research, and then at the end of it giving the token of appreciation. So that's what we generally do, but it does bring up some ethical questions, particularly if you're giving out, things like chocolate or, and it's culturally situated also. So depending on where you're doing research, I think you really need to think about that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I addressed the question.
Yeah, thank you, Antonia. That's perfect. Julia or Heike, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I just completely agree. I mean, what we've done in the past as well is, little Lego. And that's particularly, Julia, it was really nice to see that you used the Lego Serious Play. So little packets with Legos. But I was recently reading an article, and that's part of the issue with ethics, and I'm sure Antonia is familiar with that, was actually giving koha or tokens for children is actually problematic in getting ethics application through. But then, completely, we need to acknowledge the time and the effort that children put in. So definitely, little toys, things like that. So thank you.
Thank you. Another question here from Orly Orbach, based in the UK. Orly works with the Association of Social Anthropologists Ethical Guidelines, and informed consent is one of them. How does this idea of informed consent translate to child-centered research? Maybe Julia and Sharani, you could share what you did in your project.
Yes, we can. And I think it's important here with the question of informed consent to distinguish between the ethics process and doing the thing with the form, and having a really good idea of the situation to make sure everyone feels comfortable, the right questions are being asked. And situational ethics, I think, with children are incredibly important as well. So I guess, speaking as a researcher, I think I would be extremely aware, or try to be extremely aware, to emphasize, if not in some cases prioritize, the ethics in the situation, in the room, to make sure that everything works well for everyone. However, speaking as a member of the ethics committee at the University of Otago, I think we cannot neglect the other part of the process, ethics, either. And one thing that we have found extremely valuable in working with the school is not only to get approval from parents, obviously, because this is what you need to do, but to also get the teachers on board and helping to create an environment in which the research can take place in a comfortable and safe way. And I think working with, for example, teachers or families can be invaluable there.
Thank you, Julia.
Eliza, can I add something to that? And I think one thing important when we talk about informed consent as well as is the language, and also not treating, so it should be child friendly based on the age group as well. That's something to be considerate when we do informed consent. And informed consent just doesn't mean a document or a written document. So it's something which needs to be ongoing when we communicate with the children. So it can be done both as a written format and with in an oral format. So, and it can be checked as we go with the children, and children can be sometimes very honest and very expressive of whether they like to go on or whether they want to stop. So I think we have to be very mindful that informed consent is not just a signature or a mark on a consent form, but it's something which we need to be observant, and it's something which needs to be ongoing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shirani. Yeah, really good points there. And I know from my own PhD research, one of my advisors from Oranga Tamariki really encouraged me to focus on building the relationship first, because it's very difficult to gain truly informed consent if the child you're researching is not trusting you. So thinking about how that process can begin before you're even, in the same room together. So I created some introductory videos of myself and my family and things like that for my participants to watch before I even met them, to kind of have that as an ongoing process. So thank you. And we have some more questions here. From Din Mohammed, who is a PhD student at Victoria University, is asking, is there any study on the impact of tourism on children and their development? Maybe I should talk to that one. I'm doing my PhD on that to some extent, focusing specifically on the impact of tourism on children who travel and their sense of global citizenship. So hopefully I will have results to share on that soon. And there have been some studies looking at the impact of children who travel in terms of cognitive development and that kind of thing, but predominantly from the perspectives of their parents. So I think this really ties in with what Heike was talking about at the start, in terms of needing to shift some of that towards really recognizing the value of talking with children themselves and understanding their perspectives of how travel has shaped them. And then linked to that, also reflecting back on Heike's points around the importance of increasing the amount of research with children in tourist destinations. How does tourism influence children's development in destinations where they're receiving a lot of tourists and interacting with tourists on a daily basis?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Thanks, Eliza. That I did my PhD on the impacts of tourism on children living in host communities. So I looked at not so much the development of children, but looking at the impact on their sense of identity and sense of belonging, because having all these visitors come in at particular times during the year really plays with that sense of place, a sense of belonging. That's my beach and there's too many people. I can't access that area of my community. So that was really interesting, and happy for you to get in touch if you'd like more information.
Thank you, Antonia. Another question here from Zuhan Lee, who's really interested in the child-led and co-led interview and would like to ask how to choose a child interviewer. So are there any standards, or how might we consider the relationship between the children? So for example, do the child interviewer and the interviewees need to be friends or not?
So in the specific setting that we did the research in, we worked closely with the teacher as well to get an idea of which children might be comfortable in that kind of role, so as to not push any children into a situation where they wouldn't want to be the interviewer. In terms of being friends, we don't know whether the children were friends or not, because we are not that familiar with that, with a large group of children. But having said that, across the board, children were willing to support their peers when they knew that one of their schoolmates, whether they were friends or not, would be in the interviewer roles. They would make an effort to respond to their question. They weren't left out in the cold. So even if they weren't friends, the fact that they were going to school together meant that they would be willing to collaborate in that situation.
And just to add to what Julia said, also, it depends on the group that you're researching. So, for example, in my own research, I access the children and young people through youth groups in the community. So it's really important that the participants have some common interests between the interviewer and the interviewee. So yes, they know each other, but they have interest, and so there's that trust relationship between them. I think that's really important. So it depends on the research group that you're wanting to research, because every child is different.
And the setting may have an impact as well. I was later reflecting whether a school which is associated with a sort of question and answer style of communication a lot of the time anyway, might be particularly conducive to this kind of interview conversation. And I don't know whether we would have achieved the same outcome with those very same children, let's say in an afternoon in a cafe.
Absolutely, thank you. Another question here from Uta Sonja Frannek von Schumann, who's a PhD candidate at Northumbria University, and would like to know about how we can not just give voice, but also give visibility to and of young children's social interactions and practices in enclavic tourism settings on site. Heike, can I put you on the spot for that one?
Yeah, thank you. I actually thought that Antonia is probably the better person to answer that one, because she did that fantastic work with, I like that theatre idea in all of that. So I don't know, can I push the ball onto Antonia?
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted a little bit more. I couldn't understand the question. So not just giving voice, obviously, but by enclavic tourism settings, can the participants
maybe
talk?
Uta, I don't think so, but if Uta, you could maybe add a little bit more context to your question.
But absolutely, it's not just about giving voice, it's getting them engaged in the actual research process. So working with a group of children and young people over a period of time. So with the Bar and Youth Theatre, we worked with them for 2 years. So we had that really close relationship where, we trained them as researchers. We did various workshops to talk about ethics, talk about informed consent, talk about what kind of data and questions they wanted to ask of their peers or participants. And just having that really close relationship. So I guess it is time consuming, like Heike was saying, but it's really meaningful when you're working with the same group of participants over a period of time. So just depends. I think it maybe enclavic tourism means in a particular setting. I'm not sure.
No, but those are great points, Antonio, in terms of, again, that relationship, right? And building the relationship so that you can really engage with kids and get great information, which I think relates to this next question from Carla Ricaute, who's a researcher in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and became interested on this topic because of her own children, which I think is the case for many of us on the panel today. And she says that she wonders, what do you do when children give short answers? Do you use pictures or other probes?
I can speak to that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to be much more creative, and that's where, Julia and Shirani with the Lego series play, and I currently have a PhD student who's doing that as well. maybe Play-Doh. And again, Antonia spoke to that. I mean, I used photo elicitation. I actually, look, it was a while ago, but I gave disposable cameras to children, and they really liked that. And then I got it developed, and, you know, so you have to give them, yes, you have to be creative. They're talking about or answering questions is very abstract. So you really need to use some other creative forms. And there's a lot more happening with teenagers. So I've got a PhD student who's looking at African immigrants, families in New Zealand, and he's thinking about having like a digital, you know, using smartphones, using digital diaries. I tried a journal that didn't really work so much in a domestic context, but yes, you have to be think very creatively. And from my experience as well, because I interviewed the families again, this children half a year later, actually most children couldn't remember much. So yeah, you need photos. Well, some reminders. It was really quite interesting how quickly we forget things. And so you need all these prompts. And I think Lego is a fantastic way, Play-Doh, yeah, electronic things. So yeah.
Eliza,
hopefully that's answered it. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Heike, are you still or can I add something into that? Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that we have to use different techniques. And again, it depends on the children. So sometimes we can really customize based on the children, but it depends on whether you are doing a one-on-one or as a group. So for example, in my PhD, I've used something called magic boxes, and I've turned into a unicorn at one point, and so I was dressed up as a unicorn. So it can be anything as long as the child feels comfortable and what works for the child. And again, it can depend on different children and their age range. So one of my participants who was a 15-year-old, he preferred using photo elicitation and a blog page. And whereas the one with who was a 6 to 7-year-old, they preferred using photographs and even like, you know, dancing and singing. So it completely depends on children and how they want to express their views.
Thank you. Yeah, really good point. We just have a couple of minutes left. So just a final question to wrap up for you all is what would you like to see moving forward? What are your ideas or requests in terms of further research for people who are interested in doing more research involving children in tourism?
I'll just jump in there. Yeah, I'd really like to see more research planned in collaboration with children and young people. So having a say in how the research is actually conducted, like from the very start, not just when you're out there in the field collecting the data. And also, I think we need more research in the Global South. I think there's a real gap there for tourism studies in the Global South.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think we're doing a lot more research on children as in many ways consumers or tourists, be it within the family or child tourism. But I think we really need to shift it a lot more on, in many ways, what Antonia did as well, host children, host destinations, and moving forward, because we're going much more into community-led tourism. And yeah, I think that emphasis really needs to change. Admittedly, I come from, you know, a perspective doing research on children really as tourists, but I'm very aware that, yeah, that there needs to be a lot more research involving children. That's why I love Antonia's work. I can only really applaud that. But yes, and child labor issues, and more creative, and yeah, and also of course I really like what Shirani and Julia, that kind of, again, you know, we need to see, if we want to see more sustainable and regenerative tourism changes in the way tourism is being managed, we really need to include the voices of children much more as active agents.
I think that's the perfect place to wrap it up. Thank you, Heike, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us for what's been I hope, a really interesting and thought-provoking webinar. This will be the last seminar of Victoria University of Wellington for 2022. So this is the first time I've said this year, but wishing you all a wonderful holiday season ahead, and hoping you all have a lovely break over the holidays. So thank you, and please feel welcome to reach out to any of us if you have additional questions after this session.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Eliza.
And thank you, Ian, for organizing, and Eliza for hosting. And thank you, everyone who posed questions and participated. Thank you.
Thank you.